In the early years of the air war over Europe, assumptions formed quickly. Some aircraft earned reputations for reliability. Others were quietly dismissed as mistakes of design or necessity. Among fighter pilots, these judgments were rarely academic. They were tied directly to survival. By 1943, one particular American fighter had acquired an unflattering reputation. It was fast, heavily armed, and difficult to control at the edge of its limits. Pilots spoke about it with caution, sometimes with humor that masked unease. Its range was impressive, but its size made it unforgiving. Errors were not easily corrected. When things went wrong, they often went wrong quickly. The aircraft was not considered elegant. It did not turn tightly, and it did not forgive hesitation. Compared to lighter fighters, it demanded strength and decisiveness. Among some squadrons, it gained a quiet nickname, one that suggested recklessness rather than capability. The word suicidal, circulated informally, passed between pilots who understood exactly what it implied. This perception did not come from theory. It came from experience. Early combat missions revealed the aircraft's weaknesses as clearly as its strengths. When flown cautiously, it underperformed. When flown aggressively, it demanded complete commitment. Pilots who hesitated often paid for it. Yet war does not allow equipment to be judged solely by reputation. Aircraft are deployed not because they are perfect, but because they exist. As the daylight bombing campaign intensified, the U.S. Army Air Forces needed fighters that could fly farther, climb higher, and stay with bomber formations deep into hostile territory. This fighter met those requirements. Its design reflected compromise. Engineers prioritized range and firepower, accepting trade-offs in maneuverability. The result was an aircraft that excelled at high altitude and speed but punished indecision. It required pilots to trust its momentum and firepower rather than finesse. Training emphasized this distinction. New pilots learned quickly that the aircraft could not be flown like others. It demanded a different mindset. Control inputs had to be firm. Engagements had to be deliberate. Survival depended not on agility, but on understanding energy, altitude, and timing. For many pilots, this adjustment came slowly. Some never fully trusted the aircraft. Others grew to respect it, though rarely to love it. The cockpit offered little comfort. Long missions meant hours of isolation, oxygen masks pressed tight against faces, engines vibrating steadily beneath thin metal skins. The air war itself imposed its own rhythm. Missions began before dawn. Briefings were concise and technical. Maps were studied, routes memorized, contingency plans reviewed. There was little room for improvisation once airborne. Fuel calculations governed everything. As bomber formations assembled, fighters took their positions, some above, some behind, others ranging ahead to intercept threats. The fighter in question was often assigned tasks that kept it away from immediate protection. Its range allowed it to roam farther, searching for enemy interceptors before they reached the bombers. This role magnified both risk and responsibility. Pilots flying these missions operated at the edge of friendly air cover. If trouble developed, help might be minutes away, or not at all. Within this environment, confidence was not optional. A pilot who doubted his aircraft became a liability, both to himself and to others. Mockery, when it appeared, often served as a coping mechanism. Calling the fighter suicidal allowed pilots to acknowledge fear without admitting vulnerability. But war has a way of testing reputations under conditions that do not allow retreat. What mattered was not what pilots said on the ground, but what they did when formations broke, radios crackled with warnings, and enemy aircraft appeared in numbers that defied expectation. On one such mission, a pilot flying this dismissed fighter would find himself separated from support, confronted not by a single opponent, but by a coordinated enemy force moving with clear intent. At that moment, reputation would become irrelevant. Only understanding of the aircraft, of the situation, and of oneself would remain. And the aircraft that many believed could not survive sustained combat would be asked to do exactly that. By the middle phase of the air war, the environment in which American fighters operated had changed in ways that were both subtle and profound. The Luftwaffe no longer relied on scattered interceptions. Instead, German units adapted, concentrating their efforts where bomber formations were most vulnerable. Attacks became coordinated, calculated, and increasingly aggressive. For escort pilots, this shift altered the nature of their work. No longer were they simply guards flying alongside bombers. They became mobile barriers, expected to anticipate enemy movements and disrupt them before contact was made. This required endurance as much as skill. Missions stretched for hours. Fuel margins narrowed. Fatigue accumulated quietly, unnoticed until it mattered. The fighter that many had mocked was now deeply embedded in this system. Its long range made it indispensable. Other aircraft simply could not remain with the bombers for the entire journey. This fighter could. As a result, it often stayed airborne after others turned back, alone or in small numbers, operating at the outer edges of friendly support. This isolation was not accidental. Command planners understood the risks, but they also understood necessity. The bombers needed protection for every mile over hostile territory. Someone had to remain behind. The aircraft's design, once criticized, now became central to its role. Its weight gave it stability at high altitude. Its engines, when handled correctly, delivered sustained power. Its armament was formidable, designed to deliver decisive fire rather than prolonged maneuvering engagements. Yet these strengths only mattered when used precisely. The aircraft could not afford mistakes. It could not recover easily from poor positioning. Every engagement demanded forethought. German pilots recognized this. They studied American aircraft carefully, learning their behaviors and limitations. They knew which fighters turned tightly and which relied on speed. They understood that this particular fighter was dangerous when flown decisively, and vulnerable when it was not. As enemy tactics evolved, encounters grew more complex. Attacks no longer came from a single direction. Groups of German fighters coordinated to draw escorts away from bombers, forcing difficult choices. Pursuit risked abandoning the formation. Staying close risked allowing enemy aircraft through. Radio traffic reflected this tension. Warnings overlapped. Calls for assistance went unanswered as pilots focused on immediate threats. In this noise, clarity was rare. On the day that would later be remembered, the mission itself was not unusual. Weather conditions were acceptable, though visibility varied at altitude. Bomber formations assembled methodically, engines droning in synchronized rhythm. Fighters took their assigned positions. The pilot flying the much-maligned aircraft had flown this route before. He knew its distances, its landmarks, and its dangers. He also understood his aircraft intimately, not in theory, but through repetition. Hours logged translated into instinct. He knew how it responded when pushed, how it behaved when stressed. As the formation moved deeper into enemy airspace, early warning signs appeared. Enemy radar activity increased. Intercepts were expected. This was routine. What was not routine was the scale. German fighters began appearing in groups larger than anticipated. Their approach suggested coordination rather than chance encounter. They moved deliberately, probing the edges of the escort screen, testing reactions. The pilot adjusted his position, maintaining altitude advantage where possible. He conserved fuel, aware that distance mattered as much as engagement outcome. His role was not to chase recklessly, but to deny access. Still, pressure mounted. Enemy aircraft pressed closer. Some escorts engaged and peeled away, drawing opponents with them. Gaps formed, not dramatically, but inevitably. The pilot found himself farther from friendly aircraft than planned. The distance was not alarming at first. It was a familiar condition. But the sky ahead was no longer empty. German fighters gathered beyond visual range, their movement discernible only through brief flashes of light and shifting formations. They were not rushing. They were organizing. This moment illustrates the nature of wartime escalation. There was no sudden alarm, no singular realization. Instead, awareness grew gradually. The situation was becoming more demanding than expected. The pilot understood the implications. If the enemy committed fully, retreat would not be simple. His aircraft could outrun some opponents, but not all. Engagement might become unavoidable. What mattered now was positioning. Altitude, speed, and direction would determine outcomes more than raw numbers. The aircraft's reputation as suicidal stemmed from pilots who failed to respect these factors. He did not fail to respect them. As enemy fighters began their approach, the The pilot made adjustments that reflected experience rather than impulse. He resisted the instinct to engage immediately. Instead, he observed, calculating relative speed and trajectory. This patience was not hesitation. It was preparation. German tactics relied on forcing errors, drawing fighters into disadvantageous positions where numbers could overwhelm. Avoiding this required discipline. The pilot held his course longer than expected, allowing the enemy to commit first. The aircraft responded as it always did, heavily, predictably, and without forgiveness. Every control input mattered. Every decision closed off alternatives. When the first German fighters broke formation and moved in, it was clear they expected compliance. A single American fighter, isolated and flying an aircraft with a questionable reputation, appeared manageable. The pilot did not alter course dramatically. He allowed the engagement geometry to form, trusting that the aircraft's strengths would matter when the moment came. This is where complication fully emerges, not as danger alone, but as responsibility. Retreat would have left bombers exposed. Engagement carried risk that could not be shared. The situation demanded commitment, but not recklessness. As enemy aircraft closed the distance, the sky narrowed to measurable angles and closing speeds. The pilot's attention focused inward, shutting out everything that did not matter. His aircraft was no longer an object of debate or mockery. It was a tool, and it would be used as intended. What followed would not be shaped by surprise, but by understanding accumulated over countless missions. And with that understanding, the engagement moved beyond uncertainty and into action. Once the German fighters committed, the geometry of the encounter became unavoidable. Distance collapsed quickly. Altitude margins narrowed. What had been a wide sky filled with variables became a confined space governed by seconds. The pilot understood this shift instinctively. There was no moment of surprise. The enemy's movement had been deliberate, and now its intent was clear. This was not a probing action. It was a concentrated attempt to break through. He checked his position relative to the bombers one final time. They were still within reach, but not close enough to offer immediate mutual support. Other American fighters were engaged elsewhere, drawn away by similar pressure. This was the consequence of coordinated attack. No single failure caused the isolation. It was the result of overlapping demands applied across the formation. The pilot adjusted speed and angle, converting altitude into controlled momentum. The aircraft responded with its characteristic weight, accelerating steadily rather than sharply. This was not a machine that leapt forward. It gathered force gradually, like something that needed to be convinced. German fighters approached from multiple directions, their spacing disciplined. They did not rush. They sought to compress the American fighter's options, forcing him into predictable reactions. The pilot did not react immediately. He allowed them to close just enough to commit. This restraint was learned behavior. Engaging too early would waste energy and ammunition. Engaging too late would surrender initiative. When the first pass came, it was fast and precise. The American fighter did not turn tightly. It rolled and dove, preserving speed. The aircraft's size, often criticized, now worked in its favor. At high speed, it remained stable, its control surfaces responsive when handled firmly. The pilot brought the aircraft back into position using altitude rather than turn rate. This choice mattered. Turning tightly would have bled speed and invited pursuit. Instead, he kept the fight vertical, forcing opponents to follow on terms they did not prefer. Gunfire appeared in brief flashes. Bursts were short, measured. Ammunition was not wasted. Each trigger pull was intentional, aimed not to intimidate but to disable. One German fighter broke away trailing smoke. There was no pause to observe the result. The pilot immediately repositioned, aware that survival depended on constant motion. The enemy reacted quickly. More fighters pressed in, attempting to overwhelm through numbers. Attacks overlapped, forcing rapid assessment. The pilot's attention narrowed further, excluding everything except relative movement and timing. This is where escalation takes its true form, not as rising emotion, but as sustained pressure. There was no single dramatic exchange. Instead, the fight unfolded as a series of compressed decisions, each flowing directly into the next. The aircraft's reputation resurfaced here, but differently. What had been called suicidal was in fact demanding. It punished indecision but rewarded commitment. The pilot leaned into this reality. He flew the aircraft as it was designed to be flown, not as others wished it to behave. Energy management became central. Every climb was calculated. Every dive had purpose. The pilot avoided horizontal turning contests, knowing the aircraft would not excel there. Instead, he dictated vertical movement, forcing German pilots to expend effort just to remain engaged. Over time, this imbalance began to matter. Enemy fighters that attacked aggressively found themselves overshooting or losing altitude advantage. Those that hesitated lost momentum. The coordinated attack fragmented slightly, not through panic, but through the natural erosion of sustained effort. The pilot remained alone. There was no sudden arrival of support. Radio communication was limited and unreliable amid the engagement. Assistance, if it came, would arrive too late to influence the immediate outcome. This isolation sharpened focus rather than undermining it. Without coordination demands, the pilot operated solely on observation and response. His aircraft became an extension of perception rather than a separate machine. Gunfire continued in controlled intervals. Hits accumulated gradually. German aircraft peeled away, some damaged, others disengaging to reform. Each withdrawal reduced pressure marginally, but the engagement remained active. Fatigue crept in quietly. Physical strain mounted as the pilot fought against G-forces and vibration. Breathing through the oxygen mask required effort. Hands remained steady through habit rather than comfort. The sky no longer felt expansive. It had become a series of intersecting paths, each one representing opportunity or threat. The pilot stayed within this framework, neither rushing nor retreating. What distinguished this phase of the engagement was not aggression, but endurance. The aircraft, once dismissed, proved capable of sustained combat when flown within its design philosophy. Its engines held. Its structure absorbed stress without complaint. The German attackers, though skilled, were constrained by fuel, ammunition, and the growing recognition that this single fighter was not behaving as expected. It was not collapsing under pressure. It was adapting. As minutes passed, the numerical advantage that had defined the encounter began to lose significance. Not because it disappeared, but because it could no longer be applied efficiently. This is how escalation resolves itself in real combat, not through dramatic reversal, but through gradual imbalance. One side expends resources faster than anticipated. The other preserves them deliberately. The pilot sensed this shift, not as relief, but as possibility. The engagement was changing shape. What began as containment was becoming attrition. And in that transition, the encounter approached its decisive phase, not marked by spectacle, but by accumulation. The turning point did not announce itself. There was no sudden silence, no clear break in the rhythm of combat. Instead, it emerged through small changes that accumulated until they altered the character of the encounter. The pilot noticed it first in timing. German fighters were no longer arriving with the same coordination. Their attacks came in shorter bursts, less synchronized than before. Some approached cautiously, others disengaged sooner than expected. The pressure, while still present, no longer felt continuous. This was not confusion. It was calculation. Sustained combat at altitude imposed limits that no amount of planning could fully overcome. Fuel consumption increased rapidly during repeated climbs and dives. Ammunition diminished. Engines, pushed hard for extended periods, required careful management. These constraints applied to both sides, but unevenly. The American fighter, flown deliberately, had conserved more than it had expended. The pilot had avoided unnecessary pursuit. He had resisted prolonged turning fights. He had accepted that disengagement was sometimes the correct response. As a result, his aircraft remained capable in ways the enemy did not anticipate. One German fighter attempted a direct attack from below, climbing sharply to close distance. The maneuver required commitment. When the pilot countered with a controlled dive and brief burst of fire, the German aircraft broke off abruptly, trailing smoke before disappearing into cloud cover. Again, there was no pause to observe. The pilot returned to position immediately, aware that attention could not linger. What mattered now was maintaining control of space. The pilot adjusted altitude slightly, placing himself where incoming attacks would require additional energy expenditure. This choice forced German pilots to climb repeatedly, each time consuming fuel and reducing available power. These were not dramatic decisions. They were incremental. But over time, they reshaped the engagement. Radio transmissions remained minimal. There was no external confirmation of success or support. The pilot operated within a closed system defined by visibility, motion, and endurance. As the minutes passed, German fighters increasingly broke contact rather than pressing attacks. Some disengaged entirely, turning back toward their own territory. Others maintained distance, observing rather than committing. The American fighter, still alone, no longer appeared vulnerable. It occupied space with authority, not through aggression, but through consistency. It responded predictably and effectively to every approach. This predictability mattered. In air combat, uncertainty is a weapon. But so is reliability. German pilots, accustomed to exploiting hesitation, found none. The aircraft that had been mocked for its unforgiving nature revealed its advantage. It did not allow partial engagement. It demanded full commitment from anyone who challenged it. As enemy numbers thinned, the pilot's options expanded. He could reposition more freely. He could choose when to engage and when to conserve. The balance had shifted not because the enemy failed, but because they could no longer impose their preferred conditions. This is the nature of real turning points in war. They are not defined by single acts, but by accumulated decisions that narrow one side's possibilities while preserving the others. Eventually, the engagement began to dissolve. Not all at once, but gradually. German fighters withdrew in small groups, maintaining caution but abandoning coordinated pressure. The pilot remained alert. Withdrawal could conceal renewed attack. He did not pursue aggressively. His responsibility extended beyond personal success. The bombers still required protection. Only after confirming that enemy presence had diminished did he allow himself to widen his scan, checking fuel levels, engine performance, and orientation. The aircraft, though stressed, remained intact. Its systems responded as expected. This outcome did not feel triumphant. It felt procedural. The pilot had not sought isolation. He had not intended to face multiple attackers alone. He had simply responded to conditions as they developed, using the aircraft as it was meant to be used. In the aftermath, other American fighters gradually returned to the area. Bomber formations, though shaken, remained intact. The mission continued. No celebration marked the moment. There was no signal to indicate that something unusual had occurred. For the pilot, the experience folded back into routine almost immediately. Yet retrospect would later isolate this encounter, examining it not for its drama, but for its implications. The aircraft's reputation would be reconsidered. The assumptions that surrounded it would be questioned. But at the time, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the aircraft had done what was asked of it, and that a single pilot, applying discipline rather than bravado, had held ground that was not meant to be held alone. The war moved on, and with it, the story entered its final phase, not of combat, but of memory. When the mission ended, it ended the way most missions did. Aircraft landed in sequence. Engines were shut down. Pilots climbed out of cockpits stiff and tired, carrying the weight of hours spent in controlled tension. Ground crews moved in without ceremony, inspecting damage, refueling, preparing for whatever came next. The engagement did not immediately stand out. There was no formal announcement. No gathering to mark the event. In the flow of wartime operations, encounters blended together unless they produced obvious loss or strategic consequence. This one had done neither. The pilot filed his report as required. The language was factual and restrained. Times, positions, altitudes, observed enemy activity. No embellishment. No claims. This was standard practice. Combat reports were not places for interpretation. They were records. Others contributed their own observations. Bomber crews noted reduced pressure during the latter part of the mission. Escort pilots mentioned heavy enemy presence earlier than expected. Together, these accounts formed a composite picture, one that only later would be examined more closely. In the weeks that followed, the air war continued without pause. Aircraft were lost. Crews rotated. Missions accumulated. The event receded into the background, preserved only in paperwork and memory. Yet within that quiet persistence, something subtle changed. The fighter that had once been dismissed began to be discussed differently. Not celebrated, but reconsidered. Pilots who had avoided it spoke less casually about its supposed flaws. Those who flew it regularly found their experiences receiving more attention during briefings. This shift did not come from a single incident. It emerged gradually, shaped by repetition. Missions flown without escort replacement. Bombers protected deeper into enemy territory. Fighters returning damaged but intact. The aircraft's demands remained. It was still unforgiving. It still punished hesitation. But those qualities were now understood as characteristics rather than defects. The pilot at the center of the earlier engagement did not become a figure of legend. He did not seek recognition. His role within the squadron remained unchanged. He flew again, as did others. The war did not pause to take note. This absence of spotlight is important. World War II produced countless acts of endurance that were never separated from the whole. Most participants did not experience their service as a sequence of defining moments. They experienced it as routine shaped by risk. Only later, when historians revisited operational records, did the engagement gain clarity. Analysts compared enemy sortie counts with reported losses. They examined fuel usage patterns and mission timelines. Slowly, the scale of what had occurred became more apparent. One aircraft. One pilot. A sustained defensive engagement against a significantly larger attacking force. Not because the pilot sought isolation. Not because the aircraft was invincible. But because circumstance and preparation converged. The label once used dismissively, suicidal, no longer fit. The aircraft had not demanded recklessness. It had demanded understanding. In this re-evaluation, the story found its place. Not as an exception to the air war, but as an illustration of it. Equipment performed according to design. Pilots succeeded according to discipline. Outcomes followed from accumulated decisions rather than singular moments. There was no attempt to rewrite the narrative of the war around this event. It did not alter strategy. It did not redefine doctrine. It simply joined the larger body of experience that shaped how the air war was remembered. The German pilots involved were never individually identified. Their experience was absorbed into their own records, their own understanding of a sky that was increasingly contested and unforgiving. Their withdrawal was not failure. It was calculation under constraint. This symmetry matters. The story does not hinge on triumph or defeat. It rests on limits, of machines, of bodies, of attention. It shows how survival in wartime aviation depended less on daring than on restraint. As the war progressed, newer aircraft entered service. Technology advanced. Tactics evolved. The fighter once mocked became one chapter in a rapidly changing story. Its reputation stabilized, then faded into context. For the pilot, the memory remained personal and unremarkable. Like many veterans, he would later describe the war in terms of duration rather than episodes. Long days. Long flights. Long waits between missions. That is how such events are often carried forward, not as narratives, but as background. What endures historically is not the image of a lone fighter surrounded by enemies, but the quiet lesson beneath it. That warfare is rarely shaped by dramatic reversals. It is shaped by systems, by training, by the ability to operate effectively when attention narrows and options diminish. In this sense, the story resolves not with conclusion, but with integration. It becomes part of a larger truth about the air war over Europe, one where assumptions were tested daily, and survival favored those who adapted without illusion. The aircraft was never suicidal. It was exacting. And in the hands of a pilot who understood that distinction, it did what war required of it, no more and no less.